Tonight, we focused on one of the laws that we don't usually talk about and found various ramifications. You might be very surprised. Everything that we're going to be discussing tonight is under the heading of the prohibition of meat from a living animal. Now, as of course we've discussed many times, we have 7 Noahide laws, and then we have this book of about 700 pages, because each of the laws has many, many, many branches that are all coming from that law. In the law, thou shalt not eat meat from a living animal, there's the laws about not eating meat from a living animal, which we'll discuss. There's also another whole branch of laws of not paining an animal, of not creating pain for an animal, that we also will discuss. And then, and this might seem even hard for you to fathom how we get to it, but there's also the laws of not grafting, not crossbreeding animals, and not crossbreeding plants, trees. And that also is considered doing something wrong to a living creature. So from the not crossbreeding animals, we actually come to not crossbreeding, not grafting fruit trees, which is a branch of thou shalt not eat meat from a living animal. So I don't know how relevant you will find the first section, which is laws about not eating meat from a living animal, but I never know who listens and I never know what's going on in someone's world. So I will briefly go over those rules. Then I will spend more time on not giving pain to animals, because I think that might be more applicable. And then I will discuss not grafting trees, which again, depending on the reality of your life, you might not have any fruit trees in your backyard and it might not be relevant. Or I'm not going to do all the laws. I never do all the laws. I select before laws that I think maybe, will be more relevant or just more overarching, because there are many, many laws about all these things. So what parts are prohibited? So the prohibition against consuming flesh removed from a living animal is not only the limbs. It says the literal Hebrew word is a limb from a living animal. But that's the Hebrew word. But again, a limb here means any meat severed from a living animal. And I do remember, Dixie's not on now, but I do remember that she said, when she was growing up, they would castrate the animals and then they would eat that meat. And that's definitely as eating meat from a living animal as you can get. Somewhere in the world, besides, of course, in some countries that have very funny food practices, but here in America, there are people that still do that. I do remember my son was once giving a class on Noahide laws, and he asked me, Ma, do people do this? Is this relevant at all? And I Googled, when at loss, turned to Google, and found many dishes, but again, like Pan, Asia, those cultures that do use what we would call meat from a living animal. Seafoods, there's definitely still it being done, but in sort of a conventional American diet, hopefully not. But again, we never know how animals are killed nowadays. And if an animal is killed in a fashion where we're not really sure if the animal's completely dead when they start chopping it up, that would also be called meat from a living animal, which is why a Noahide should be careful what meat they buy. And definitely if it's a cheap meat, like, McDonald's style meat, we would be concerned that maybe the animals were stun gunned, which is the cheapest mass way of killing animals. And it's very possible the animal was stun gunned. It's not completely dead once they really start cutting it up. And that's why Noahide would be careful in terms of what meat they eat and how the animals were killed, to make sure there's no concept here of meat from a living animal. It doesn't make a difference how big the piece of meat is, if it's the complete part of the body, if it's a tiny sliver. Any meat from a living animal is a prohibition of this violation. A person could say, well, if I'm cutting off this piece, is de facto killing the animal, then it's not meat from a living animal. The animal's dead, which is an interesting point. And the truth is there's some validity to that. It depends what happened. Now, again, we're so far removed from this, it might seem like, what? Who cared? But in more earlier time, there was a lot of reality to this law. And it was like eating meat from a living animal was considered something, it sounds like a cruel, horrific thing, but things people did because it had all the life in it. A lot of idolatrous practices involved cutting off meat from living animals, because you still have all the life of the animal in it, as versus cutting off meat from a dead animal. So unfortunately, this is something that historically man has done. So if a person would cut off a limb, knowing that without this limb, the animal is going to die in 6 hours, That's meat from a living animal. Yes, your cut killed the animal, but when you made that cut, the animal is still alive. If part of the body was cut, which immediately causes death, like the head was chopped off, that both causes death, and now you have a piece of meat. So at that point, that would not be considered meat from a living animal. You kill the animal through that cut, and then you have the meat. But if you cut off a vital organ that in 2 hours and 3 hours and a half an hour, the animal's going to die, that's not considered killing the animal. It's considered meat from a living animal. If a person would cut off a piece of the animal and not take it, like I'm going to cut off the spleen, and I know in doing so, the animal's going to die, but I'm going to wait till the animal dies and then I'll take the meat. No. That would be considered meat from a living animal, because even when you remove it, the animal's dead, but when you cut it, the animal was still alive. The animal's hide is not considered meat generally. So if someone would cut off a piece of the animal's hide, that would not be considered meat from a living animal, because the hide's not meat. But if it's not really the hide, but if it's like the softer skin, which is edible, then it's already meat from a living animal. The horns, the hooves, claws, those are not considered meat from a living animal. And if those parts were cut off, that would not apply to them. Of course, you probably can't eat any of those things, but if you cut them off and then use them in some fashion, that would not be considered this prohibition. It's interesting, just one last thought on this, is that even if an animal has an extra limb, that extra limb got cut off, that we consider eating meat from a living animal. Even if you had to cut off that extra limb because the animal can't have this extra limb, it would actually be dangerous for the animal to have the extra limb. Still, if you would eat it, that would be considered eating meat from a living animal. So there are myriads more laws, which I'm not going into because, again, I don't know in our current modern civilized American world if this comes up so much, but definitely in your ancestors' past, it truly did. Something which I did feel was more relevant, and again, depending on where you live, you more see animals or you less see animals, but restrictions on causing suffering to a living creature. Bylaw of this prohibition is the restriction on causing suffering to a living creature, which is, of course, something that even if you don't have too many living creatures around you, dogs, cats, squirrels, but every living creature, we, as much as possible, want to refrain from anything that will create unnecessary pain. Meaning we're allowed to kill an animal. We're allowed to eat an animal. It's our food. God gave us that since Noah. But we're not allowed to create unnecessary pain for the animal. Adam was given dominion over all living things, and he was given permission to use them for labor, to use them for any tasks. If you need this donkey to carry your belongings from point A to B, if you need this horse to ride on from point A to B, if you need this ox to plow, you have dominion over the animals. They're yours to use, but they still weren't yours to eat. From Adam until the flood, over 1,500 years later, the first 15 plus 100 years of mankind, nobody ate any animals. It was forbidden, and it wouldn't even cross their brains. It would be like it wasn't even like relevant. Like, of course we don't eat the animals. How can we eat an animal? But Noah, since he saved the animals, since he and his sons worked for an entire year, they were in that ark for 1 year. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. They were in the ark for a solid solar year. As a reward for saving the animals, mankind, all of us are descendants of Noah, we're given permission to eat the animals. We're not given permission to needlessly kill or wound an animal. Only if we need to eat its meat. Only if it's beneficial to us. But there's no creature, not an animal, not a fish, not an insect, not a bug, no creature are we allowed to just kill for the sake of killing, for the pleasure of killing. Completely forbidden. We don't have that permission. That would be considered a cruel act. And obviously here, we as humans need to become refined, godly people, and we don't engage in needless cruelty. Now, if an animal is causing pain or discomfort to a human, you can harm or kill them to stop the pain they're causing to you. In other words, if there's an advantage to the person, we overlook the disadvantage to the animal. If the animal is causing pain for the person, then we're allowed to give pain to the animal to remove the pain from a person. We put humans before animals, obviously, as we see from the very simple fact that God gave us permission to slaughter animals for food. We're putting humans in front of animals, because if we put the animals first, then how do we have the right to eat them? Eat plants. Well, who gave us the right to eat the flesh of a fish or the flesh of an animal? God said, no, you can use the animals for food. For that same reason then, if we needed parts of an animal for medical reasons, you're allowed to kill that animal for this benefit for man. If there was another way to do it without killing the animal, then ideally do it another way. If there's not another way, then you're allowed to do it. And it's not only for medical purposes, for any purposes. There's some things that could cause an animal pain. We don't want to pain an animal. We're not supposed to pain an animal. But if this is a human need, a real need, and there's no other way to get it besides through giving pain to this animal, then the need of the human comes before the need of the animal. You're even allowed to kill an animal for the sake of an animal, if you're responsible for that animal. If you need to feed your dog or another pet that eats flesh, are you allowed to kill an animal to feed that animal? You absolutely are. That's your human need to feed your animal. But if you see a hungry stray dog, are you allowed to kill an animal to give that stray dog food? Nope. Why not? Because you don't have the right to put one animal in front of the other. Just as we were discussing last week about human, obviously, at a much higher, more significant level, you don't put one human in front of the other. We understood that. Well, on this very different level of animal to animal, am I to decide, as we said, whose blood is redder? Am I to decide who's more important, this animal that I'm going to kill or this starving wild dog that will die because he doesn't have food? Not my responsibility, not my judgment call, and therefore I am forbidden to do that. But if it's my dog, then I'm allowed to, because I have a responsibility to feed my dog. I have a responsibility to feed my animals. So since I have a responsibility to feed my animals, if taking the life of another animal is helping me as a human do my responsibilities, then I'm allowed to, because I'm allowed to take the life of an animal to help me as a human in my needs. Obviously, you're allowed to take the life, but you can't do it in a way that causes needless suffering. So we have to be careful to do what we can to minimize the suffering, even in a situation where we need the animal and there's going to be some suffering, but we want to do it in a way that minimizes the suffering. If a person has an animal that's working for him, like a farmer, are you allowed to strike that animal to get it to work if it's just being slow and lazy and not interested? We're told yes, because again, this goes back to the same rule. There's a certain principle we keep following. You're a human, your needs take precedence. You need this ox to pull this plow. You need this horse to pull this carriage. You're a human. You have a need. Yes, if the only way you're going to get your animal to move is by striking it, you're allowed to, but not severely, not with cruelty. Never allowed to strike with cruelty. So if you enjoy hitting something because you have this aggressive nature, no, that's absolutely forbidden. If you're striking just the need to get it moving, that is permissible. Can you poison an animal then, which would kill it? You're not going to eat the food, obviously, if you poisoned it. You don't want poison in your system. If the animal is harming you, you can. If there's a dog around that's causing harm, you can put out poison and it's going to die. You're allowed to, because again, it's harming you. Any animal, any insect that's harming you, you are allowed to kill if that's the means of removing it. If an animal is walking on your property, you're allowed to drive it out of your property, trampling your grass, it's eating your flowers. Well, you say, oh, I shouldn't be cruel to the animal. That's fine. Your needs come first. You don't have better fences and you need to drive it out. You're allowed to drive it out. But again, we always try to do things as kindly as possible, as gently as possible. There's a story in the Talmud, the great leader of the Jews called Reb Judah the Prince, Reb Yehuda the Prince, and there was a weasel in his house. And the maid wanted to sweep out the pests. She wasn't going to kill them, she would just sweep them out. Some young weasels, obviously you don't want a weasel in your home, but Reb Judah the Prince said, no, I don't want to. Even though it's totally permissible, we're not killing, we're not really causing pain, we're just sweeping them away. No, he said, I leave them be. I don't want to on any level do anything to disturb even an animal. Was that required by the law? Absolutely not. According to the letter of the law, there's a weasel on your property. You can do whatever you want to get rid of it. And if you have to poison it to get rid of it, you're allowed to do that too. Do whatever you want. But we see here from this example, and it's recorded in the Talmud, which means it's something that we're supposed to know. If one wanted to be extra pious, I'm not telling you to leave the weasels, but he left the weasel. Maybe we could envision this in terms of ourselves with insecticides, with insect traps, rodent traps, lethal rodent traps, non-lethal rodent traps, rodent poisons, we would try to do those that do not cause needless suffering. Like, for example, a glue trap. Someone could say, oh my gosh, the animal's stuck on the glue for hours until it dies. That's so much unnecessary pain. And not use that glue trap, even though you're allowed to kill these animals. You're allowed to kill a rodent on your property, 100%, no question. But even as we're allowed to kill the rodent, we'd rather kill it with a poison that's going to be a quicker, less painful death than a glue trap, which is going to be a more slower, more painful death. But we're told, let's say the only thing that works is a glue trap. You have mice, and the only thing that works is glue traps. Then you're allowed to use a glue trap. But if something else will work just as well and be less painful for the animal, lessen the pain, then ideally we should use what will lessen the pain. Because again, even for these rodents that surely should not be in our house, and we definitely don't want them there, and we're definitely allowed to kill them, but we still want to have compassion to God's creatures. We want to be compassionate people, and compassionate people means going all the way down to the mice or the ants or the roaches in someone's house. Doesn't mean they have to flourish there. But even as we're getting rid of them, we try to have compassion. And obviously, again, by the same token, let's say there was an animal that was harming people, or a wild animal that was loose. Oh, an animal escaped from its cage in the zoo. Yeah, obviously it's very expensive. These animals caged in the zoo, they probably don't want you to just kill them. But if there's no choice, yeah, of course. If an animal has any thought that it's harming a person, we do not put the animal's life ahead of the person's, even if the person was at fault. I don't remember how many years ago it was. Anyone remember? I think it was in like Cincinnati. Some like young child jumped into I don't remember where it was, like a bear cage or something. And
a monkey or a gorilla.
Yeah, it was a gorilla cage. Yeah. And they shot the gorilla, and there was a whole uproar, and everyone was talking about it. It's really the child was at fault. The mother of the child was at fault. This gorilla, it's so expensive. It's so rare. What planet are we living on? Maybe we could have gotten out the child. Maybe. We don't play around with human life. So even in that situation where the child was at fault, I don't know, the mother was at fault, doesn't make a difference. The gorilla was not at fault. Why should the gorilla die? Only might. Yes, if a child might get killed. But of course, we're never allowed to kill or torture animals for sport, for entertainment, as of course, historically has definitely happened and still happens in parts of the world. So obviously that we're never allowed to do. But when there's a human life there, we don't think for a second. We put humans in front of animals whenever there's that situation. So can you hunt animals? Obviously, the answer is very clear. Only if you need the meat. Now, unfortunately, throughout history, hunting was a sport. Hunting was something people did for fun. They also ate the meat. But that's not why they were hunting. They weren't hunting for the meat. They were hunting for fun. Nowadays, there are people that hunt for fun. It's a sport. And they come back with these big trophies. If you've ever heard of Shields, there's one in Springfield, and it's a fascinating store, and it's a hunting store. And they have all these mummified, I don't know if that's the right word for it, stuffed heads of all these animals that are real animals that were really killed by people for sport. The fact that they afterwards ate the meat is irrelevant. We have meat nowadays in our world. We don't need to hunt animals for meat. They were hunting animals for the sport. That is absolutely forbidden. Again, if you're in a situation where you need the meat, you're 100% allowed to hunt an animal. But if you're doing it for fun, it's forbidden. It's a very painful way for an animal to be killed, and it's absolutely forbidden. Again, if you would see a wild animal that's coming near where humans live, and it's an animal that could harm humans, no question, you kill the animal. That's not hunting for sport. That's hunting to protect humans. What about the whole question of a zoo? So that's actually a question. Is one allowed to have a zoo or not? Because in a sense, you'd say in a zoo, the animals in a certain amount, of course, nowadays they try. Obviously, modern zoos are very different than what zoos used to look like. And modern zoos very much try to recreate habitats and to give animals places to roam. But it's still not like their original conditions. But the answer is yes, a zoo is not forbidden because there's a benefit to humans. So that's not considered like hunting. Hunting is considered a sport and it's considered something that's cruel to animals. And therefore it's absolutely forbidden. A zoo is not considered as cruel to animals and is not considered a sport. It's something that's a human benefit. It's not a sport, it's a human benefit, and therefore it is permissible. If someone could raise animals, who have in their backyards animals, and you could say, well, is this really the nicest place for this animal to be? Wouldn't the animal want to just roam free? It's not considered cruel to the animals. There's benefits to being raised in someone's backyard. There's regular food and water, and your health needs are taken care of. So it's not considered cruel to the animals, and it's considered a benefit for the person, because generally people that raise animals, maybe they're lonely and maybe the animals alleviate their loneliness. So in such a case, we say, again, the need of the human takes precedence. So you could say, well, why can't we hunt? It's also, I have a need for fun. No. A sport that's cruel and kills animals? No. Raising an animal in your home that alleviates your loneliness and the animal is taken very good care of is considered appropriate. A zoo, especially zoos nowadays, where the animals are taken good care of and it's for a human need, is considered appropriate. But hunting animals is not. Declawing an animal is permissible because, again, we put the benefit of the human that the animal would otherwise damage, and therefore that temporary pain for the animal of declawing is permissible for the need of the human. Any questions on any of this? I'm sure the overriding principle was very, very clear, and I gave many examples. I didn't give all the examples, I didn't give all the laws, but I just want to be very, very clear in the nuances of this situation. The prohibition is meat from a living animal, from which we have a prohibition of causing pain to any living animal, which includes to mice and vermin and ants and roaches. All of those are living animals. All of those we cannot give pain to. For the same token, something else I don't mention here, but you might not think of this. Oh, who hunts? Fishing. People go fishing and don't eat the fish. People go fishing sometimes in polluted waters. So, and they're told, and these are places where people go fishing, and they're told, oh, well, don't eat any of the fish that you're gonna catch because it's, the waters are very polluted. The fish, be full of things that are not healthy for you. Sure, no problem. So what are they fishing for? The fun of it, the sport, the joy. Completely forbidden. If you're not going to eat the fish, you cannot go fishing. Same way, you can't go hunting. You can say, well, you can't go hunting for sport. You can't go fishing for sport. You're going to eat the fish? Okay, you can go fishing. You're not going to eat the fish because you don't like fish, because there's such tiny fish with so many bones, it's not worth it for you, because you can't be bothered cleaning the fish, because the fish are in polluted waters. You're not allowed to go fishing. Again, a very small but very practical example where this could be very relevant to someone's life. So really important to have these principles clear. And when the principles are clear, then the details are usually fairly obvious. Another branch of not having meat from a living animal is not mating different species of animals, cross-mating different species of animals, and, as we said, cross-grafting species of trees. A person could say, why? Like, what does that have to do with anything? The basic point is, and I'm not going to go into cross-mating different species of animals, because that I assume is completely not relevant to anyone here, but I am going to speak a little bit about the laws of cross-grafting trees, even though that might not be relevant, but for some of you there might be fruit trees in your backyard, so it might be relevant. So I'm going to go into just a few of the laws. The basic overarching point in cross-mating animals and cross-grafting trees is violating God's nature. Cross-mating animals is far worse and far more severe laws than cross-grafting. As we'll see, if I get to all the details of the laws in the remaining minutes, we will get to them. And then you will see that actually in certain ways, we're more lenient with trees than with animals, because with animals, it's much more severe. But with the trees or with the animals, it's the same point. God created nature. God created these species of animals. God created these species of trees, of fruit trees, talking here specifically about fruit trees, and don't mess, except God's work is perfect. Now, of course, we as the consumer are fed many varieties of fruits that come from trees that were grafted together. Cangelos, I mean, there's so many. We're allowed to eat them. The person that made them, he messed up. And that was forbidden. Once the tree produced fruit, even the person who made them is allowed to eat them. And for sure, everyone else is allowed to eat them. So the person who cross-grafted is liable, but the fruits that come from that, again, these fruits are for human to consume, and therefore we as humans definitely are allowed to consume them. And you should never have the sense of, am I allowed to eat these fruits? When I know so many of the fruits in the market are cross-grafted, and so many are. We want the sweetness of this, and the tartness of this, then the largeness of this, and the firmness of this, and they're always experimenting. So they're wrong, but the fruit produced, we are allowed to eat. Now, you're always allowed to cross-graft trees that are not fruit-bearing. The only prohibition is with fruit-bearing trees, because again, that's producing something. And that's the idea of you're creating a new product, not how God originally intended it. But if two different barren trees are grafted together to produce a better wood, not a problem at all. Or a tree that's barren is grafted into a tree that's fruit-bearing, not a problem at all. But if it's a fruit-bearing tree and another fruit-bearing tree, it is forbidden. And this also applies not only to trees, but also vines, like a fruit-bearing vine, like a tomato plant. That's a fruit-bearing vine. So if that would be grafted with another fruit-bearing vine or fruit-bearing tree, that would be forbidden.
I have a question about this.
Sure.
So you mentioned that so you can eat it if it was grafted fruit tree or vine, but what if you have seeds from those grafted fruit trees or fruit vines? Can you grow those on your own?
You can grow them because you didn't graft them.
Right.
So you were allowed to grow them. But if you were told, to really, for best optimal use, it's good to graft it with, totally forbidden. But the seeds themselves, yes, you're allowed to grow, and that is a good question.
Okay.
And it would be the exact same idea, as Danielle said, as eating those fruits. Like, why are we allowed to eat those fruits? The person did wrong, but the fruit is already produced. Fruits are here for us to benefit from, for us to consume, for us as humans to elevate to God by eating them and then using their energy to serve God. So as such, that person was wrong. It's even interesting because in the law, even the person that grafted the trees is allowed to eat the fruits, which I thought was very interesting. But that's the law. You're allowed to. But the fact they're allowed to eat the fruits does not in any way mean that it was okay what they did. It was not okay, and they're allowed to eat the fruits. Allowed to do also very interesting, which again might or might not be relevant depending on what's going on in your backyard, is you're allowed to plant two fruit trees in very close proximity, where there could be some natural grafting that's going to go on. That's not you, that's nature. But why'd you plant these trees so close together? Maybe you were hoping they would graft. You're allowed to do that. You just can't physically do something that grafts one tree to the other. There's many details in all these laws of many different things. Ruth?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, am I allowed to? It's not like I'm gonna do it, of course, but I want to make sure. Like 2 different types of apples. May I graft it in or no?
That is an interesting question.
Or 2 different oranges. Okay.
I don't know. I will look at an excellent question. I will ask, that's a really good question. But going into the idea of you're allowed to graft trees that are not fruit-bearing, it's important to understand what the sages would consider a fruit-bearing tree. So, for example, a spice tree is not considered a fruit tree because they're not producing fruit. There's no fruit that's a food, so therefore it's not a fruit tree. Trees and vines that produce fruits not fit for human consumption, but eaten by animals would be prohibited to graft. You're like, well, why is that a fruit tree? No human eats those, but animals do. So if animals eat them, it's already a fruit. And as such, we can't graft it to produce a bigger one, a stronger one. A rose bush, a perennial rose bush is considered a fruit tree. All bushes, by the way, I think I might have skipped that point because I'm conscious of the time. But when we say tree, any bushes will be considered what we're viewing as a tree from this perspective, as there are very specific laws of trees or vines that I'll explain very soon. But a rose bush, if it's perennial, is considered a fruit tree because from the roses, people would make jams. So as such, that's a fruit. And therefore you cannot graft, which of course they do all the time, to get better roses, bigger roses, longer blooming roses. All that would be forbidden. Even if you're grafting not for the purpose of getting a new fruit or a better fruit or a different fruit, you're grafting for a different reason, it's still absolutely forbidden. Meaning, like, let's say you were grafting two trees and one of them is old, it's a male tree that doesn't produce fruit, it doesn't make a difference. This is from the fruit-bearing species, it's a male tree, its trunk is cut off, it's an old tree, it doesn't make a difference, it's all forbidden. These are the laws and they're followed in all these situations. So when we say a fruit tree or a fruit vine, in the context of the prohibition of grafting, it might be a little different than how we normally would understand those terms, trees or vines. So any perennial plant that has a trunk, it has leaves and flowers growing from the, leaves and fruit growing from the branches, that's a fruit tree. Even if the trunk withers away in the winter and a new plant grows from the roots the next year, we wouldn't consider that a tree. But that is considered a fruit tree because it's perennial, so it's considered a fruit tree. So grapes, berry bushes, blackberries, raspberries, all other perennial bushes, all other miniature trees would all be considered fruit trees from this perspective of the prohibition of cross grafting. If the roots do not survive from year to year, then they would not be considered a tree, even though they have leaves and fruit on their branches. But if the roots do not survive, it's not a perennial, then it's not considered a tree. It's a fruit vine. Well, a fruit vine is a non-perennial. It has leaves and fruits on a thick vine that grow from the roots. So that would be tomatoes, melons, squash, cucumbers. All of those are fruit vines. And again, there would be the prohibition. So obviously, like grains, wheat isn't growing on a vine. So there you don't have a prohibition in improving the grain. Of course, they do all the time, trying to improve the wheat, mixing it with different things to try to improve, make a better wheat. That's not forbidden. It's not a tree. It's not a vine. It's no prohibition at all. If you had, like Danielle said, the question of, well, she has seeds. Is she allowed to plant those seeds? I said, yes. She just can't graft them. So if someone has a hybrid fruit tree in their backyard, it's not like now prohibited and they have to cut it down. That's a tree. The person that made this hybrid was wrong, but once the hybrid is there, it's a tree and it's treated like any other tree. So many laws, but I just want to bring out this point to show you the difference. So grafting, we said, is prohibited. What is permissible with plants, but not permissible with animals, and I'm bringing this in because I want you to see that there is more leniency with plants than animals, meaning animals is even more overtly trying to tamper with nature, trying to improve on God's creation, and as such forbidden. Trees is considered a lesser degree, and therefore it's still forbidden, but the laws are a little more lenient. So what's an example? So if you would take the sap or hormones from one fruit tree and you would inject it into another fruit tree, that's permissible. That's not considered cross-grafting and is permissible. Cross-pollinating flowers of different species of fruit trees is permissible. It's not considered grafting, so it's permissible. Now, doing something similar to an animal, like, artificial insemination, is completely forbidden. So we see the animals in this, how you would do it to an animal versus how you do it to a plant. This would be the same concept, totally forbidden by the animal, totally permissible by the plant. Again, the theory, the reasoning for both the animals and the plants is the same. God created nature. We treasure and uphold God's nature. We don't try to make animals better than God made. We don't try to make plants better than God made. We trust that God made exactly the perfect animals and plants in this world, and therefore we do not tamper with them. But hopefully the overarching ideas were clear, and definitely what we should walk away with is how we have to be so careful not to harm unnecessarily, needlessly, any creature, to have compassion. Some people like say, and I know some people say, oh, so therefore, if there's rodents in your house, you're not supposed to kill them. No, we put human needs first. But if possible, do it in a way that's less pain-inflicting. And this whole piece on the trees and the little mentioning of the animals is, again, another branch of this concept of really understanding this is God's nature. These animals are God's creatures, and therefore we treat them only for use and don't let them be a victim of cruelty. And these animals and plants are God's creations, and therefore we respect them as we are and don't try to tamper with them.